boy, we're about to let all the professionals out. We're talking about wiring. Trust, but verify. Those are a couple of words that are going to come in very handy, and I'll explain more after we go through some of this wiring. And that came from my pastor a long time ago, and it definitely helps out, whether it be doing wiring or actually working with a team. Okay, it's pretty obvious we're talking about wiring today. Now, it feels like every couple of years we have to release a video. I guess we don't have to. But I feel led to release a video because I see a bunch of stuff online, stuff that doesn't make sense, mistakes being made. And let's face it, I have made all of these mistakes we're going to talk about. So we're going to just talk about some do's and don'ts of wiring, things that work, things that don't work, as well as tooling, crimping. Do you crimp? Do you solder? Do you not? Do you use insulators? Do you use heat shrink? What type of heat shrink do you use? What type of wiring do you use? So let's just start with a basic butt connection. Or let's just call it a splice, not a butt connection, because we're going to use one where we're not using a butt connector and another one where we do use a butt connector. And I've heard a lot recently of people in automotive and even in marine that say never ever solder connections. I think that's baloney, because when I think it's soldered correctly, you shouldn't have an issue with the solder joint. It's not going to get brittle, it's not going to break, and it's definitely not going to do as bad as some of the bad crimps that I see. So let's talk about it again. So we've got a bad spot in a wire, whether it be in a car, in a boat, wherever. And we need to either replace that section or maybe we just need to join some wires back together. So let's start again with a simple, we're going to first make sure you prepare for whatever you're going to do. And that means remembering your heat shrink before you ever get started. And I know that's probably more than enough, but we're going to make sure that we have enough on there. So I'm going to put my heat shrink on first, especially kind of in a closed system. It would be one thing if the other end of the wire was open, we could slide that on. Otherwise, we're going to get that on there. And then we're going to take this wire right here, and I'm going to overlap it about kind of 2/3 and then twist them together. Okay, so I'm going to make me kind of a manual connection here. And then we're just going to put electrical tape on there and be done. No, you cannot do that. That's not the way to do this. And then I'm just going to use my third hand, which, by the way, buy a third hand or fix up something like this. It comes in very handy. And this is probably 16 gauge wire, so I don't think you need a lot of heat here. So I've got a simple cordless soldering iron here. I'm going to heat it up, and I don't know, turn it up to around 600 degrees or so. Make sure you can see that okay. Make sure your tip is clean on the soldering iron. And here's a tip right away. You don't need big, thick solder to make these solder joints, okay? Get that out of the picture. Get you some really fine electronic solder that's going to melt pretty quick. And also go ahead and tin your tip, meaning get some solder on there. And by the way, if the solder won't take to it, you need to clean it. You need to either just do it on a wet sponge or maybe even take some Scotch-Brite before it's hot. Or you may even need to take some emery cloth or some sandpaper to it. But it should be able to take solder like that. And I always like to get a little bit on there. And then, this is the complaint that people talk about, is that we make and I'm just going to get a little solder to pool on there just for heat dissipation, or heat transfer really. Because I want that wire to take the solder, not the soldering iron. So you see that wire soaking up that solder? I'm done. I'm done right there. And what we're looking for is we're making sure that we're getting penetration into those wires. So you can see where the solder is not just pulling up on there. It's actually sunk inside of those wires, and it's made a mechanical bond with that solder. Also, let this solder get decently cool. You don't have to let it get cold. But don't just let it flash off and then grab it and run with it. Make sure that it's decent to the touch before you start messing with it. But that should make a nice mechanical bond that's not going to go anywhere. Now, the problem that people have with solder joints is when people just keep feeding the solder, and what happens is it follows that heat, and that solder will flow up up these insulation, up the wire into the insulation, and you could have a solder joint this wide if you kept feeding it. You don't need that. You just need that right there. We move our heat shrink over. We take our heat gun. And you may not be able to see this, but sticking right out the edge here is a little bit of goo. In other words, if you look at my heat shrink, it says adhesive line. That means there's glue inside of here that's heat activated, that once this heats up and shrinks, it's also activating the glue. So now we have a nice sealed connection in there. So there's no butt connector in there. There's nothing in there making it bigger other than the wire wrapped around itself. We have a nice strong bond, and now we've sealed it to the elements. We don't have any water intrusion, any salt intrusion, salt air intrusion, anything like that. We've got it nice and sealed and a good mechanical bond. Now, I'm sure there will be some that will argue out there, which please feel free to put it in the comments of what you disagree with that splice connection right there, because it's not going anywhere, and the chances of it even vibrating and breaking right there in the middle is very slim. And that heat shrink is also providing a little bit of strain relief as well for that connection. Now, let's assume that in the same situation, hey, even though we joke about it, we definitely want to hear your comments. So feel free to let me have it in the comments on anything you like or dislike, or maybe you've got some tips for me. Well, obviously it wouldn't be the same situation, but maybe we were at a spot where we really kind of ran out of wire, or we're having to piece the same wire back together. And in fact, let's even shorten this up a little bit. And so now space is a little bit of an issue, and we don't have enough wire to wrap around itself and be able to solder it, pull it together, because maybe we're barely reaching the plug or the alternator or whatever it is we're trying to repair. Therefore, we want a butt connector. And I would much rather have a bare non-insulated butt connector and put my own insulation on it rather than having a butt connector that already has insulation on it, like this. So this, my butt connector's in there kind of hidden, and I really can't see the crimp when I get it done. On this one here, I'll be able to see my crimp once I crimp it. And it just enables me to kind of put an eye on it before we're done with it. Sorry for the third hand. I'm just trying to give you a better sight of this. So now we don't need our soldering iron. And we want to make sure that we use the smallest butt connector for the wire size. We don't want that sloppy. And I'm going to go ahead and get it in my crimping pliers. And then you can see the nice crimp on there, the nice mechanical crimp. Give it the old pull test, make sure it's not going anywhere. Same thing here. Good squeeze. And now I know I've got a good mechanical bond there. Now I can slide over my heat shrink. And so there we have it. We have a soldered joint with heat shrink on it or insulation on it. And then we have a butt connector joint with heat shrink on it, insulation on it. Nice and sealed from the weather. Both are probably never going to be an issue because they've been done right. You got a good mechanical bond connection here with the crimp, good mechanical connection with the solder, and then your heat shrink to cover it up, seal it up as well. Again, very important. I like to use marine style adhesive, or at least adhesive lined heat shrink, or marine style heat shrink, or adhesive lined heat shrink, to make sure that that adhesive actually oozes out once we heat up that tubing, and make sure you're using the correct size so it does firmly grasp onto that or shrink down to the size where it's actually bonding to that wiring. Now let's talk one more type of splice connection that's become more and more popular, and that is these low temperature solder connectors here that are pretty nifty. Not sure if that one's going to work. No, that's not going to work. Let's go to the blue, maybe the green. 18 to 16. Yeah, that'll fit. Okay, so basically what I'm going to do, instead of putting on my heat shrink, this is the heat shrink and the bond connection. I'm going to slide that on here, and then I'm going to, I'm going to make that a little smaller. Don't need all of that. Same dance. Good few twists there to get us a a temporary mechanical bond. And then we're going to slide this over. And basically what we have right here is a low temperature solder that when activated with a heat gun will actually melt. Now you want to be careful, and you want to make sure that you're applying this heat not so much randomly, but kind of all over the place. You do want to keep it centered because we want most of that heat going to that solder first. And so now that solder has now, you can see it squeezed out both sides of that ring. And so now I'll move out and actually activate the rest of the heat shrink. So just from the heat gun, we have activated that solder, and it's actually flowed into the wires to, you can see to the right, the shininess to the right and to the left. And the center is shrunken down, as well as the outsides are now shrunk down. And so now we have a nice mechanical bond here. Now, what I cannot attest to here is how well that low temperature solder will keep itself strong, if you will, or be resistant to other outside forces. I really don't know. It may be just as strong. I just don't understand how it works, and again, the longevity of that. So I would caution to it. I would say that it's a great option in a pinch, or when you definitely got to seal something up, and maybe even something that maybe doesn't need a lot of strength, if you will, or you're not worried about it too much. I think that's a great patch option because, again, you're not having to break out a flame, you're not having to break out a soldering iron, you're still getting that mechanical bond, but with just literally, one tool as well as, one accessory there to use for bonding that. It seems pretty strong here. I'm not pulling that apart at all. But again, just my thoughts on that. Now let's talk about terminating wires really quick. So we've got a couple of different terminals here, actually 3 different ones. 2 of these are actually insulated terminals. Here's one, kind of the old school, the hard plastic insulation on them. Here is kind of the new ones that are more expensive that have, basically that's heat shrink built onto them. So the insulator is the heat shrink. Still crimped on using insulated crimpers, which, by the way, there's a difference between insulated crimpers and non-insulated crimpers. And then this is a non-insulated terminal here for crimping onto wires, again, without insulation, which you would add your insulation or add your heat shrink to it afterward. So first, let's take a look here at this non-insulated terminal. If you look closely, here on the top side, there's a little slit in there. Now, this has actually been brazed over, which means it's a little better terminal than a non-brazed, non-insulated terminal. But basically, there's a little slit there in the stamping of the metal, which is probably less strong or a little more weak than on the opposite side. And therefore, there's a way to crimp these, and there's a way not to crimp these. Now, the thing is, with the insulated crimpers, you really don't know where that slit is, although they always should be, when the terminal's kind of laying flat like that, should be on the top side. So that should be where the slits are. But like on a spade connector like this, you really don't know which is the top side. You can kind of take a gander and figure it out. But still, my point is, you really are not absolutely sure. Now, these right here are your typical non-insulated crimpers. And everybody's probably got a set of these in their toolbox that they've gotten from Uncle Tony, Granddad, bought them at your auto parts store, at Walmart, something like that. And this is where you have your red, your blue, and your yellow style crimpers. And it's just got a little oval there. and you crimp down on it the best you can and pray that you actually get a good mechanical connection. This is a set of ratcheting crimpers that does the same thing. You say we have the yellow, the blue, and the red, and we have a larger opening here, smaller opening here. This side's doing the crimping. This side's just kind of crimping the insulation, but this is actually crimping the terminal on this side. So there's a side to use as well. And the ratcheting crimpers, it actually lets you know you're all the way done when they spring back and open up. So that's one good thing about ratcheting crimpers is if you haven't gone all the way through, they haven't been properly crimped. Now this is a new set from Icon, from Harbor Freight, which is pretty nice little wire strippers or actually wire pliers that I just picked up. I was at the store and just bought them. So not sponsored whatsoever. But anyway, there are cutters right here on the back side. There's cutters right here in the front of the jaws. There's little pliers here on the front side. You have a bare crimper here, or non-insulated crimper there, insulated crimper here, and then all your different wire sizes from 14 gauge all the way up to 24 gauge for stripping wire. And feels kind of like a small set of pliers, and they seem to work really well. Now here is a set of ratcheting insulate or non-insulated crimpers. So same way with the insulated, the jaws here, you're going to clamp them down, and then it's going to, based on the different sizes, be able to crimp those where it needs to, and then release once you're done. So let's grab one of these old school terminals here. And we really don't want that much wire sticking out, so I would say let's trim a little of that off. And there we have a little bit of copper sticking through. Go to our blue connector. Make sure we're in the middle of that terminal and give it a squeeze. And so, pretty typical of things we've seen in the past. That actually feels like it did a decent job of crimping that on there. Yeah, it's actually giving me a pretty good mechanical crimp, even with these cheapies. But let me give you a little better example with these here. So again, we're going to crimp on this side, and so there we have it. So all the way down, and it'll release. So now we get a good crimp. I should have actually backed off of it a little bit, but you see where it kind of crimped the back side to just squeeze it down, but also crimped the metal there, which again, giving us a nice strong bond there. So even with insulated crimpers or insulated terminals, you should be able to get a decent bond, but I'm just not crazy about not being able to see that connection like with something like this, which, by the way, so you can see the little tongue there that's going to actually depress and make the crimp. I do not want to do it on that crack. Remember we showed that to you earlier, on that seam right there. I do not want that tongue to go in that seam like right there. I want it to go on the back side of that terminal. So now the seam is pointing down away from that little tongue that's actually going to go in and make the crimp. So put our wire in. See, we're sticking through just a little. Give it a good squeeze. And then we'll see here, that's on the front side where we have that seam in the metal, in that brazed metal, and that's the back side. So we got a nice, good penetration there. That's not going anywhere. Then we can take our heat shrink, slide it up. Now we've got a nice, clean, and strong connection. Now, if this were a power wire, I would have definitely wanted to trim that wire back a little bit, make it not stick through so much. But in this situation, I think we're fine. Again, we're getting the goo or the adhesive that's actually squeezing out of the heat shrink as well. And the same way with this insulated connector here. We'll go to the red side. We'll make sure our crimp is happening on the metal body itself. And then we'll ratchet all the way down. Release. And we did not get a crimp on that. So very interesting. Maybe our ratcheting crimpers are not working like they should. So I'm going to go to my manuals. And it's a decent one, but I can tell you, I feel that sliding back and forth. Again, one of those situations where I just really can't see that crimp. Therefore, I'm sure I probably did something wrong. But the bottom line is I have a loose connection, which is going to create heat. A loose connection is always going to create heat, and probably down the line going to actually fail at some point. So I'm not knocking these whatsoever, but we can't see our connection. It looks like that I've got a crimp on it, but for some reason, it is just moving back and forth. And same on that one. You can see it just kind of curled that up because it looks like that, like I was talking about, we're on that slit and it just kind of rolled it up. Whereas on this, I know I've got a good strong bite. I'm going to go one more time with the ratcheting crimpers there, making sure I'm biting right there on the metal. Still no go. So could be these, who knows? But I've got 3 failures on that without a success. Now I'm going to use a little thicker wire with a yellow connector just to see if we can make a go of this thing. So I would say make sure your crimpers work too. And then this set here is a set of ratcheting non-insulated crimpers. Again, confirmation that we have a good bond there. And the reason you don't want to use a non-insulated crimper on an insulated terminal, and you can use it, and I'll show you. So we'll get a good solid crimp, not going anywhere. However, you've now pierced that insulation right there. So if this is a power wire of some sort, now you can possibly ground this, arc this, something like that, especially when now you take your heat shrink, which, by the way, I talked to a guy that actually inspects boats, actually does wiring on boats, and he said, you will not believe the amount of people that buy these types of heat shrink terminals and then leave them like this and either put tape around them, put other heat shrink around it, but never take their heat gun. So they paid 5 times as much for better terminals with heat shrink on them, and then they don't take the time to do this. But remember, somewhere right along in here, we probably pierced that, and now we have actually a spot that could possibly ground. Now, the answer to that, if you were in a pinch and needed to use that, just take you some heat shrink, put it over there, or some electrical tape to be able to cover that up, and now you should be good. But now we know we have a good, strong mechanical bond, and we've got it nice and sealed. Now, the thing I don't understand is that these cheap terminals here, the same size wire, same tool. Nope, that one did not crimp either. So bottom line is trust but verify. All of these different connections, whether it be insulated terminals, whether it be heat shrink insulated terminals, whether it be bare terminals or non-insulated terminals, or whether it be soldering, always verify that connection is worthy, okay? Give it a little bit of a pull test. Now, you don't have to strain it as much as you can, but let's face it, you want to put a little bit more tension on it than it's going to face in its normal everyday life to make sure that you've got a good mechanical bond. I like soldering. Anytime I can, I will solder, and I don't think it's a bad thing. Don't over solder. Don't make that solder joint 3 feet long when it only needs to be about 1/4 inch long. And then again, your brittle point is only that 1/4 inch, which is probably really non-existent. And then make sure you cover it up with some good heat shrink that's also adhesive lined, as well as the same as you saw. We had a bunch of failed attempts at these terminals here, which I don't believe it's the terminals. I've used these before, And again, verified that they work before I used the heat shrink or the heat gun and actually shrunk the heat shrink on it. But for some reason, these crimpers were not liking these terminals here. It seemed to work okay on the, cheapy plastic ones, but we got one to fail on that as well. You may argue, well, you used the wrong size wire. I did go upsize in wire and it did grab a little better, but still with the same size wire, we got some to grab good and some and many that would not at all. So whether it be your crimpers going bad, whether you're using the wrong crimpers, using the wrong wires, regardless of any of that, if you trust the connection but then verify that it actually works, then you're not going to have a problem of something failing down the line, or at least you're going to mitigate that shot, make it less likely for it to happen. So anytime you're doing wiring or really anything, if you can do any step you can to, again, minimize that likelihood of it failing, you should do it. Hey, let us know in the comments if you want to see something different. Let us know in the comments if you had any argument whatsoever with anything we did, or if you maybe have some better ideas, something you've heard in the past, let us know. Have a great day. Make sure you follow us on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and even TikTok, and keep smiling.